Good afternoon. I'm Ernie Strickland, Senior Vice President of Workforce with the Greater Memphis Chamber. Thank you for joining us for today's Zoom meeting. Today's topic, how to meaningfully address racism and injustice with your employees. As citizens across our nation voice their frustration and anger after witnessing the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis and other events across the country, we have heard from Chamber members who want to create safe spaces for dialogue inside of their businesses. When COVID first hit our community, the Chamber acted quickly to establish a COVID-19 business resource page in order to provide resources, tools, and information to assist our companies and our community in surviving and thriving in this crisis. Although we face a different crisis, the Chamber has a responsibility to, again, assist companies and community with resources, tools, and insights. One of my favorite quotes comes from Dr. Michael Beckwith. He says, "Pain pushes until vision pulls." At this moment, we are a country in crisis. We are at a pain point. Today's conversation will be with three visionary leaders who will offer insights to help pull us toward progress. Joining us on the panel, we have Beverly Robertson, Greater Memphis Chamber President and CEO, John Daniel, Executive Vice President and Human Resource Officer with First Horizon, and Fred Towler, Chief Diversity Officer at International Paper. We'll start with a moderated panel to give you tools and guidance to connect you with your employees, and then we'll open it up for questions. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A function, which is located either the top or bottom of your screen in the navigation bar. We'll be monitoring the questions and we'll ask them beginning around 12:30. Also, I'd like to take this moment to thank Waddell and Associates for hosting this Zoom meeting. We couldn't do it without Waddell and Associates, so thank you for hosting us today. So let's get started. As the saying goes, you can't heal what you don't feel. So our first question to the panelists, what can business leaders do to make a statement to employees that shows we are concerned and that we care? We'll start with Beverly, and then John, and then Fred. Beverly.
Well, thank you very much. And let me first of all express my deep gratitude to John and to Fred for joining us today. Issues of racism and injustice are very difficult issues to discuss because they're hard to confront, frankly, but confront them we must if we want to make one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all a reality in this city and in this country. So thank you, gentlemen, for participating with us today. Leaders of organizations can do a number of things, but I would characterize them this way. I think they must listen, they must read and learn, and they must act. And when I talk about listening, I think it would be important to listen to your Black employees. Give them a safe space and give them room to talk. These conversations may be hard for you, but they're also hard for them because companies rarely ask opinions during volatile issues like this. The other thing you might want to do is convene a group of Black employees and ask them to identify the internal issues and perspectives from their vantage point, and maybe even identify ways in which these issues can be solved. Now, I recognize that some organizations have climate surveys and all kinds of tools to measure that, but they don't dig deep enough into the core of some of these issues. And I think your employees would have a really good handle on what exactly needs to be done and exactly what these issues are. Generally, climate surveys survey culture, and that's important as well. When these issues come before leadership, I do think the leadership must champion the execution, track the results, and really hold folks accountable. A lot of times people at the top really want change, but the devil is in the belly of the beast. And there has to be accountability, ways to measure that, and ways to identify what that is. And I'll stop right now and allow others to respond.
And John, same question. What can business leaders do to make a statement to employees that shows we are concerned and that we care?
Yeah, I think a very important thing, this month I'll celebrate my 45th year working in banking organizations. So, I've been through a lot of generations and a lot of change on this issue. And I think, we did a good job in those. The first decade was rough on this issue, but we did a good job making the conversation effective about kind of breaking down barriers and removing inequalities. But I think there's like a third rail in business, is that there's certain things you don't talk about. You don't take positions on social or political issues. And that's probably true to some extent. But I think this issue of equity, that in fact, at some point we have to reframe and accept that it's okay to have a conversation in the workplace about the fact that the system has inequities that need to be corrected. And I think part of the challenge is in our language. When we say something like that, systemic inequities, people right away take it to a personal level about their prejudice or their bigotry or their racism. And that's not what we're talking about at all, right? The system has inequities. And what I love about, our company's CEO and, reached out to employees and said, I'm feeling your pain. And, we recognize that there are systemic inequities, and, we're working as a company at multiple levels in the community, among our employee base, with our customers, to try to find ways to remove those inequities. So I think the first thing is framing up that this, you don't want to talk Republican and Democrat, maybe you don't want to talk about public policy issues, but in this issue, having it a part of your conversation is a good one to have, and it frees you up to create the kind of conversations Beverly talked about, creating a safe place for people to then talk about their personal situations and challenges when facing those inequities.
Great, thank you, John. Fred, same thing, same question for you. In the green room, we talked about international paper and how well you all put together policies and processes. What can business leaders do to make a statement to employees to show that we care and that we're concerned?
Thanks, Ernest. And I obviously agree with both Beverly and John. What I would add to that is, I can tell you what we have done at International Paper. Mark Sutton, our CEO, sits on the Federal Business Roundtable, the U.S. Business Roundtable. You may be aware that the U.S. Business Roundtable issued a statement about a week ago, and Mark Sutton signed on to that as one of the key leaders on the Business Roundtable. In addition to that, though, what he did was send out a communication to all of our employees, certainly expressing his concern, sharing with employees how he felt, certainly recognizing the tragedy as well as the inequities that exist, the systemic inequities that exist, and giving the employees an opportunity to communicate back. Subsequent to that, I also issued a communication to all of our employees as well, just simply expressing again my views and my thoughts, but more personal from a perspective of how I feel. And we received a lot of good feedback from our employees. But the most important thing about that was, I think what Beverly and John has also supported by saying, how do we create a safe space for all of our employees to have conversations? International Paper is a global company. And the one thing that I said to our employees is that we are all impacted by this, regardless of where we sit, regardless of our status, regardless of where we are around the globe. And how do we create safe spaces for all of our employees to have an opportunity to share? And then as leaders, it's our responsibility to listen. And listening is listening with the influence or the opportunity to be influenced by what's being said. Okay, and I think that that's a really important thing. Be transparent as leaders, be vulnerable, not to solve problems. This is not about solving problems. This is about creating an opportunity to have a conversation. So it's one thing to make the statement. The next thing is important, if you will, is allow your body language, all right, to support the statements that you're making.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next question, as I think about it, my role with the Chamber is overseeing workforce development. Our signature initiative is Upskill 901. We talk a lot about upskilling and reskilling an individual skill sets in order to be relevant and marketable. But there's a different type of learning that has to take place within the society and within the job place. Amazon reports that books on systemic racism are making the bestseller list. Many are on back order. So my question is, what resources would you recommend that leadership provide for those who want to learn more about the larger issues taking place? And we'll start with John this time.
Yeah, well, I have a couple of favorites, and one of them is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, the sociologist, who talks about why it's so hard for white people to talk about race. And, we are socialized from a very young age that, race is a delicate subject. I mean, all of us have the imaginary story of a woman in the grocery store who has a young child who notices a person of color and points out the color of the skin, and the mom immediately shusses them because it's sensitive and delicate. And wouldn't it be wonderful if our first response is something like, if you're a person of faith, isn't God amazing that he created, people with such wonderful diversity or something like that. But we were uncomfortable about talking about race, and that spills over into the workplace. And I think White Fragility creates a framework for us to think about why that is true. And the other one is Courageous Conversations by Singleton, which helps create some definitions around, explains the difference between racism and prejudice, and explains institutionalized racism. So if we get on this, if we're talking about those issues, we're talking about the same thing. Because I see now, for example, with the Colin Kaepernick thing, two sides of that issue. And it's amazing how they're talking about two separate things. And there's a lot of emotion generated. So I think Courageous Conversations would be one. And I have to say this, I'm a board member of Facing History and Ourselves, which is a wonderful organization that uses the lens of history and literature to teach students how to fight racism and discrimination. And we have an a Facing History organization here in Memphis, and they are filled with wonderful resources to help create tools to have these conversations about race and discrimination and bigotry, and right in our own community. And they're easily accessible through the Facing History office and through our website. So I'll mention those three. There are so many. And I think it's really important that we encourage people to delve in so that when we're talking about and using the same definitions.
We'll ask Fred the same question. What resources would you recommend, Fred, for leaders to provide to those who want to be lifelong learners and know about the larger issues?
Well, there's a lot of literature out there. There's a lot of books out there. I read a lot. But I will tell you what I think is most important in terms of resources. The most important resource is the individual that you engage with on a regular basis. To me, that is the most important resource. We don't spend enough time talking to each other and understanding the issues that someone faces. Because guess what? Everybody's situation is different. We're all different. And the environment that Ernest, you grew up in, even though both of us are African-American males, the environment you grew up in could be very different than the environment that I grew up in. All right. So we could spend a lot of time reading a lot of books, or we can go take action and have conversation and dialogue. And to me, that becomes the best resource. I would ask people to think about, or what I tend to think about is my biases all right, and understanding my biases. And not all biases are bad, all right? There are some biases that are good. So how do we understand what our biases are and how those biases influence us to make the decisions that we make, to behave the way we behave, to engage with individuals the way we engage? All right, it's recognizing those biases. And there's a lot of literature that's out there and books that people can just go on and Google understanding biases. And, there's 30 or 40 pages that will pop up. All that information is all good. But what's important is understanding those and then trying to use that information to understand your own biases and understand others' biases. All right. So that's part of really about being an individual and being transparent and being a leader, in my opinion. The other thing I would add is that there is a book called The Personal Leadership Philosophy by a gentleman by the name of Ed Rogero. And it really talks about sharing what's important to you, your idiosyncrasies, what you expect of people, and what people can expect of you. All right. And that's foundational, that I would say everyone should take an opportunity to review and understand, because the minute you begin to share what's important to you, you allow people to hold you accountable. And I think that's something that Beverly talked about a little bit earlier. How do we allow ourselves to be held accountable? Part of that is building a relationship, and relationship is based on trust, and part of that is transparency. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. Thank you. And Beverly will ask the same question. I firsthand witnessed the safe spaces that you created, and I appreciate your leadership. But share with us what you would recommend for leaders such as yourself to help individuals with their learning.
Thanks, Ernest. I want to build on what Fred said. I think what Mr. Daniel said was correct as well, because I think people learn in different ways, and there are lots of opportunities to learn, whether it's books or podcasts. But I will tell you, one of the most powerful things that happened at the chamber was when I opened the conversation one day with my own personal story and perspective of what was going on, and then asked the team on the phone to share. And they shared openly, emotionally, honestly, and they were all touched. And I can't tell you how many emails I got after that experience. So sitting down, talking to individuals, trying to really understand where they're coming from is really important. And Ernest, we talked about a lot of things that we would do. I want to talk about a language that tends to be packed with lots of innuendos and things you may not want to do. So we've talked about some do's. I want to talk about some don'ts. So from an African-American standpoint, I think you should avoid telling African-Americans it has nothing to do with race. And I say that because when you say that, their personal experiences have told them otherwise. So you can't know how they are interpreting what they are seeing through a different lens. So I would say avoid saying, oh, that has nothing to do with race, because in their eyes, it might well have something to do with race. The other thing I would suggest is, I hear this all the time, and I understand the well-intended meaning, but I've heard people say all the time, I don't see color. Somebody white saying to me, I don't see color. Well, how could you not see color? I mean, that presumes that color is a bad thing to see. My color is not bad. I am proud of my color. I understand what you're trying to say, but that is not the right kind of expression because its implications say otherwise. I also think it is hard for people of color to understand the notion of when someone says, well, someone said something to me. If I said someone said something to me and I thought that was racist, and then somebody else chimes in, well, he's not a racist. Well, how do you know? Are you the arbiter of that? Are you a person of color, black or brown? How do you understand their interpretation of what is said? So I think we have to be careful about that, because, you know, the arbiters of that are people who experience that and really understand that from a visceral standpoint. The other thing I've heard people say is, all lives matter. You know, when you hear the Black Lives Matter chant, there's a tendency to say, well, all lives matter. Police lives matter. Of course they do. But the group being targeted and killed is not all lives. It's not the police. It's Black lives. So let's focus on the issue and don't divert or detract. We recognize that all lives matter. But it seems to us, because of the killings and the crime that's being perpetrated, then it seems that Black lives don't matter, which is why the chant, all of Black Lives Matter is important. The same thing with the sanitation workers. When they marched in '68, they were being marginalized, disenfranchised. So they said, I am a man too. So that expression means something, and you can't qualify that. So I think we have to keep those things in mind. And the last thing I would say is, if you're not committed to being real and substantive in whatever it is organizations choose to do, just don't bother. Because people understand when your actions or your words are authentic, because they're typically followed by actions, and there is usually accountability behind it. So I've taken down the do's, but here are some don'ts. And, we can put this up on our website if you think there's value in it. But I do think it is making people aware sometimes of how statements that are said could mean one thing to you, but the way I filter it through my lens, it means something totally different.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Beverly and I talked offline regarding the Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. And I was on the internet surfing, and a gentleman put it so eloquently. He said, it's like having a subdivision and there's a house on fire. A fire truck comes in to take care of the burning house, and other neighbors say, well, what about my house? My house is important as well. Well, your house is not on fire, so let's deal with the hot spot. And of course, all the houses are valuable and important. So thank you all for sharing on that particular question. Beverly mentioned sanitation workers, and it reminds me of, during the civil rights movement, business leaders could contact leaders of the movement, like former Ambassador Andrew Young and others. But today is different. We are in what I like to call the blockchain era of protest, meaning there's no one leader. Very few key leaders. The movement is distributed, not centralized. Plus, we've all been locked in our homes for months now, right? So just as COVID created new norms, there will be new norms pertaining to equity. The question is, as an organization, what do you do to promote economic equity, or what many are calling economic justice? And for that, we'll start with Beverly.
Okay, so I thought you had enough of me with the do's and the don'ts, but let me just say, when you start thinking about this whole notion of equity and economic justice, I think it's important to understand that we have to build a culture of honesty and openness within organizations. And sometimes, because I've worked 19 years in corporate America and I'm an entrepreneur, it's important to have open discussions and dialogue. And we also need to make sure that if an organization awards bonuses, we don't create a caste system within the organization. If the organization indeed does reach its goals or exceed its goals, then everybody up and down the organization ought to reap the benefits of that. So I think it's really important, even from an equity standpoint, from the standpoint of compensation or bonuses, open our eyes to understand that everybody has contributed to much of what is going on in the organization and ought to be beneficiaries. I also think we ought to offer professional development to everybody up and down the line. Everybody has potential. Everybody can be developed. The key for organizations is find the right seat on the bus in which to place people. Everybody is not rightfully placed in the positions where they can maximize their talent on behalf of the organization. And so I think from an equity standpoint, we need to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to grow and develop and be the best that they can be. And then I also think that while there are pieces of information or certainly subsets of information that are confidential within the information, I think having an atmosphere and an openness in an organization about communicating with everybody. It is really important for all to understand what is going on, the progress that is being made, and to be rewarded equitably for what they're doing. So those are just some practical ways to build equity and economic equity, even within organizations.
Okay. Fred, how about you? Same question.
Yeah, before I answer the question, if you'll allow me, I want to just go back to something that Beverly said when she answered the prior question. And, you know, this is what's happening at International Paper, okay? We have 50,000 employees globally, all right? And the majority of those employees, all right, are Caucasian or let's say non-minorities, all right? What we find happening today is that a number of our employees are wanting to know how to start the company. All right, a number of them are asking, well, what questions should I ask? How should I ask the question? How should I start the dialogue? And a number of them are concerned that they may say the wrong thing, their body language may imply the wrong thing. Okay, and what I've said to our employees is this, okay, start somewhere, all right? Extend yourself, find a way to extend yourself. And then our employees who are on the receiving end of that, and if those employees are African-American, they have to be willing to give you the credit and the opportunity, okay, to do so, all right, without necessarily reacting. And let me just give you one example on this, and that is that, you know, we have really been active in trying to get our LGBTQI community within International Paper, you know, kind of engaged. And one of the things I said to them is, look, I know about what would fill up a thimble about the LGBTQI community. So I'm going to tell you, I am going to get this wrong. So understand that. I'm going to get it wrong, but I'm not getting it wrong because I want to get it wrong. I'm getting it wrong because I'm learning. I'm trying to understand, all right? And if you will allow me, all right, to do that, if you're willing to teach me, I'm willing to learn. But at the same time, okay, you can't get upset or concerned or frustrated because I might do this wrong. My intentions, all right, are certainly honorable. So I think that applies to the same situation today, okay? If people wear this on their sleeve, all right, we won't be successful. We have to give people the opportunity to get it wrong, but recognize their intentions, all right, are heartfelt and their intentions are just with trying to learn and grow, okay? So thank you for that. So real quick, 30 seconds on the economic equity. We have the same things that you know, Beverly talked about, the compensation programs. We have a strong development program that stretches across all of our employees. We have diversity and inclusion plans, all right, which focus on not just one segment of the population, but the entire segment of the population with an eye towards, as an example, by 2030, you know, 30% of our entire workforce will be women. You know, by 2030, 50% of our US workforce will be minorities. So we have goals which we've established, and we're holding the organization accountable for accomplishing those goals. And then turning externally, we recognize the need to create economic empowerment and economic equity across the organization. That's the reason why we support, things like women and understanding feminine hygiene care. It's amazing how many girls don't go to school today because they don't have the proper feminine hygiene care. And that's one of the things that we're doing to create, economic justice, economic equity. All right, you got to figure out how to get to the root and try to break the cycle. And that's one way that we're focusing on how to do that. So thank you for your time on that.
Last but not least, John, same question regarding economic equity or economic justice.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. First Horizon, we're still trying to figure this out, right? I mean, we have a leadership team that really cares about it. And so part of figuring it out is to put together an integrated plan. And I'm not talking about some grand strategy that's changed the world, but we have an integrated plan that includes corporate social responsibility, which I could talk about, how we're going to break down barriers for our employees, our communities, our suppliers. And so we have an integrated plan. And, the first thing to acknowledge is what we're trying to do there is to recognize that there are inequities in the system and that you can't trust people individually. You have to build systems to work against the systems that aren't working right. I'll give you a couple of examples. We as the banking system was assigned by the Treasury Department to deliver the Paycheck Protection Program loans to small businesses recently as part of the relief from COVID, right? And First Horizon, along with the whole banking industry, we're glad to take that on because we felt like we were part of the solution to this crisis rather than maybe in the last recession, some thought the banking industry was the cause of it. We don't think that was true, but we saw this as a great opportunity. And, as we started distributing those loans, I was so proud of our bank president, David Popwell, and the team, because right from the beginning, they started asking questions like, let's make sure that we get these loans delivered to women and minority-owned business and to less advantaged communities. And the idea there is if you start with an idea that you recognize that the system out there has inequities to it, you start right away thinking about those things when you roll out a program. So that's one example. We have a number of relationship managers that deal with small businesses. And we put together, a training program to help, and that included bringing diverse customers in to talk to them. Because while there are minority relationship managers, the vast majority of them are white, and a lot of our potential customers are minorities, minority-owned women businesses. And so we had the customers come in and sort of share with them the examples of bias they face every day. If a customer walks into the bank and, gets a negative, has a negative first experience where they get a lot of questions and whatever, and they might have a negative reaction to all the things the banker is asking them, and the banker might not have the right mindset. But if that banker now has a better understanding that African-American businessman that walked in to apply for a loan had struggles at multiple levels because of bias and low expectations and even racism, they had to overcome all that obstacle. By the time they're sitting across them, they're already frustrated. And so we spent some time trying to educate don't just assume when that person walks in, they're just walking in with their dream. They're walking in with a whole bunch of stuff that's happening in the world. So that's one thing you can do. I think the one thing that I also want to say is based on my own personal experience, right? I think a big step, and Fred really touched on this when he talked about, and Beverly, we talked about having the conversation, right? You've got to create a safe place for people to have these important conversations, but they can't, corporate leaders in America, business leaders, whatever, cannot check their diversity and inclusion at the door and go home. Like, I think it's really important in Memphis. We're one of the, 30th, I think 29th and 30th in terms of poverty and economic inequity. And I would love our leaders to at least get involved in one organization. Like I'm on Facing History and Seeding Success and other organizations that are committed to overcoming equity. Well, you don't have to be on many, but can you mentor a young African-American student or get involved some way so that you personally can connect with the people that are impacted by these systems. You know, one example that I'll share with you that's happened, my wife is African American. As a corporate executive, I get invited to a lot of events that include Memphis corporate business leaders, community leaders. You know, in the last 3 years, there have been 3 events with hundreds of people where we attended that event. And my wife was the only African American guest there. And many of the people waiting on us were African Americans. This is 2019 and 20. All of those, they were wonderful people, great citizens of Memphis, people, many of them I care about and see as good leaders in our community. But for me, I saw that as a lost opportunity, because if we could come together in those kinds of events, you know, bring African American or other minority groups together in those environments, we're going to get to know each other so we can create that safe place we need to have the right kind of conversations where we can understand, oh my gosh, I had no idea what you face. And it's better to have that. So when you come back into the workplace, you're not, you know, you're informed and aware of kind of the challenges your employees. I mean, 30% of our employees are African American. And if we want to have a great workplace, those people, those employees have to feel that the people around them got their back and understand them. I mean, that's the key thing that an employee wants, right? They want a job. They want to feel important. They want to feel that their work matters. And they want to feel that their boss and their employees got their back and understand them. And I think we can make a lot of progress if we expand our diversity and inclusion work to our own personal lives.
Well said, John.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. As promised, we want to allow time for the participants to ask questions of the panelists. We have a Q&A function, should be in your navigation bar, probably at the bottom or top of your screen. So please feel free to ask your questions in that particular box. I'm going to ask my colleague, Bobby White, our Chief Public Policy Officer, to come on and facilitate the Q&A portion of today's meeting. Bobby.
Thank you, Ernest. I want to appreciate all of our panelists and each of you who are on the line. In the interest of time, I'm going to move rapidly to a number of questions we have received. I do want to probably point out at this moment, and going to ask Fred to actually get back on the line to maybe say a little bit more about it, because I think one of the things that we have seen is the empathy. There are 2 discussions: empathy and equity. On one hand, identifying with some of the issues and things that we are seeing, but the larger question or challenge of equity being something that is something that we'd like to see addressed here and there. And Fred, could you say a little bit more about those goals that you all have set around equity? It's almost as if you guys have put SMART goals on equity and what you'd like to see happen at your company. Would you mind saying just a little bit more regarding that?
Yeah, sure. So I've been the Chief Diversity Officer for the organization for approximately 18 months. And we have, International Paper has had a very active diversity and inclusion effort for some time. But we wanted to take a little bit of a different approach because we wanted to kind of accelerate, you know, our results in this area. So the leadership team and I got together and we came up with, and our senior leadership approved, what we have now is what we call our 5 diversity and inclusion goals for the organization. And we have publicly communicated what we call our Vision 2030 goals, which includes the representation, and then the other 4 goals support those within our organization. So the first one, again, is about ensuring by 2030 that 30% of our workforce globally, all right, will be women. And 50% of our salaried workforce will be women by 2030. 25% of our U.S. workforce will be minorities. And we specifically talk about U.S. because of those of you that, you know, are global companies, you understand that the record keeping and the tracking doesn't exist as much outside the U.S. as it does inside the U.S. for a number of reasons. And to that end, we consider that a complementary goal for the U.S. Our regions in terms of Europe, as well as Brazil and Asia and Mexico, will also be coming up with what they consider to be their region goals, similar to the region goals that we have for the U.S. Following those, we have what we call our engagement survey, and we have a diversity and inclusion bank of questions that's part of our engagement survey. We've been doing engagement survey for the last 20 years. And our goal there is to improve our survey results from 75th percentile to 80th percentile by 2025. We have what we call a salary diverse retention goal, which is focused on retaining our salary diverse talent across the enterprise. We also have a goal focused on succession planning, and that ensures that we have a talent pool for the organization and ensuring that every job that we have open on that succession pool has diverse candidates on it. And then the fifth goal, and probably the most important one, in my opinion, is developing people capability. And how do we help our organization through experiences to develop the capability that they need in order to be inclusive, collaborative, and engaged leaders within the organization. Does that help?
Absolutely. I will tell you that you, Fred, and John are on this line for a reason. I think that those are really great and inspirational, quite frankly, to the hundreds of people we have on the line. So thank you for that. I want to ask another question we've received. And this really relates to picking your spots. I'd say that I would even use this example. I no longer, I see flags that have masts, and I don't even know what they mean anymore because there's so many things that are happening at any given time. How do you pick your spots to speak out on issues that are sensitive issues? And then the other part of that, doing it while also being very cognizant that you have a company brand. So what's that balance look like? What are y'all's thoughts on that? I'll pitch that to you, John, and also Beverly.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, I think we can, this can seem like a really daunting task, but you know, I'm a kind of the keeper of the culture here at First Horizon, and my colleagues hear me say this all the time. You know, if you think about it, you know, if every employee has 10 to 20 conversations during the course of the day, you know, there's a lot of definitions of culture, like the way we do things around here or the values and beliefs that we hold. But, you know, one definition of culture for me is the sum total of the quality of all the conversations that happen in our company in one day. You know, if you have 5,000 employees and they have, you know, 10 or 20 quality conversations a day, let's call it 10, you know, 10, that's, you know, 50,000 conversations. You know, what's the quality of those conversations? Are conflict resolved effectively? Do people feel connected? Is there trust between people? And then extrapolate to the community, to all our partners and customers. I think the way to think about it is look for those opportunities to improve the quality of those conversations. And, you know, we do that in HR through many interventions. You know, we train leaders to be more clear in giving direction and helping to understand what motivates people. We do conflict management to help people resolve conflict. But I think additional responsibility is making sure we create space. I mean, social capital is this notion that the greatest strength of an organization is the connectedness and trust and innovation that grows out of deep relationships. And those relationships get impacted by stuff that flows from the outside. And, you know, we know our African-American employees that we talked to, all of us were really struck by and hurt by what we saw happen in our country in the last couple of weeks. But we really could feel the pain that they were feeling because of the way it touched them in a very deep personal way because of the life experiences they brought. And I think they brought to the workplace. I think we need to understand that impacts this is about work. This is about the fact that we will be a great organization if we have 50,000 really high quality conversations. So it's picking out those conversations that are not going well and finding ways to improve them, improving somebody's conflict management skills, improving somebody's awareness of how their biases are showing up in the workplace, creating safe place for people to hear about the personal experiences that people of color face and how they bring that into the workplace. And if you understood that more, you would have better trust and better conversation with them. So I'll close with that. Think about it as, how do I improve the quality of those conversations in our company and in our community, and just start knocking them off one by one. And, you know, a couple of years from now, you'll see a real difference.
Thank you for that. Beverly, I actually will set you up with this next question, given I think those have been two great answers here. We've had a couple of questions along the same lines, and I think this also goes to a point that not every company has great culture. From the standpoint, many times the leader of a company might be great, and it comes to a point when people ask for feedback. The ask for feedback ends up being more cosmetic than it is real and appreciated. And that's on down the line, not necessarily held by the person at the top of the company. So I think the question for you, Beverly, is any thoughts you have on how to approach that, how to better create those safe spaces, and should it be done in are we talking one-on-one conversations, small groups, entire staff? What are your thoughts just regarding how you create these safe spaces, and in what way do you do that? Is it entire staff, one-on-one, small group, or some combination?
Thank you, Bobby. I think it's a combination of all of the things that you just mentioned. First of all, I think that when you are talking to individuals, people who are members of your team, and you're offering tough feedback, first of all, I would hope that you would have established a base of trust with your employees so that they understand that what you say to them, even if it is firm but fair, sometimes it's hard to swallow. So having a relationship or a sense of trust with them, I didn't say a friendship, I said having trust with them, so that, you know, you have built that credibility, you have taken the time to sit with them. And I think when you start talking to people, you really need to say something positive. Everybody does something good. You know, we also do things that are often not so good, but if you can start off with the good, you know, you actually temper maybe in their minds what is to come. But I also think you have to be honest with people. People can't grow if you are superficially talking to them about something that they need to improve. People can grow when you are honest and you're open and you are truthful, because what they will soon discover is that you have a set of expectations that are aligned with where they want to go. And as long as they know you are rooting for them, you are trying to grow and develop them, you are providing them exposures that will build their sense of confidence and get them to the next level, even if it is a difficult conversation. I think leaders can't be shy about having the tough conversations. I used to tell people, you know, I might like you, but I can fire you. I can fire you if you're not doing a good job, but I fire you with a sense of humanity. And I allow you to maintain that humanity, because it is really important these days, because people are very emotional. They have access to all kinds of things. And you want them to leave understanding that they contributed some positive things to the organization, but perhaps their skills weren't aligned with the needs of a given job. Or maybe the conversation was a tough conversation, but they can see how that conversation will benefit them long term. So if you put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're talking to and ask yourself, how would you want to be able to receive feedback? I think you might get an answer to your question.
Thank you, Beverly. I have a question here. I really appreciate the insight so far. We have a few moments remaining. This is a question I think others have. The question is just regarding this, in addition to the couple of people who sent it in. What is it that white people can do to be more supportive of African Americans during this time and as they kind of deal with these larger issues that have framed what we're dealing with, from the police brutality to racism, evident in culture here and there? What is it that white people can do to be more supportive of African Americans, especially those who are dealing with the trauma of what we've seen in recent times? Did we lose you, Beverly?
Oh, you were talking to me. I'm sorry. Hold on, Bobby.
Yeah, sure. Sure, Beverly, or Freya, or John, either of you all.
Okay.
Anyone can jump in on that one.
Yeah. I think I'd like to hear from the corporate guys, because I don't want to dominate the conversation. Thank you, Bobby. So I'm going to defer to my colleagues.
Okay, I'll try to answer that. And what I would say, first of all, it's a great question. And I've been getting this question a lot. And I guess what I would say is this is not easy, because if it was easy, we wouldn't be having these conversations, all right? It's complex. And it's also not something that you've got, a panacea, all right? And you're gonna be able to do one thing and it's gonna solve everything. So my response to that question is, extend yourself, reach out and have a conversation. I'm not asking people to have many conversations, have a conversation, all right? Create a safe space, acknowledge the fact that you don't understand, and this is not necessarily about fixing problems, all right, or solutioning. This is about having a conversation. This is about me trying to understand what you're feeling, all right, so I can process. Because again, a lot of individuals, if you will, are there's a lot of anxiety because you don't want to do the wrong thing. You don't want to say the wrong thing, all right? But again, as I said earlier, set the table with the expectation of what you're trying to accomplish. And what you try to accomplish should be very simple. You want to listen, all right? You want to learn and you want to grow. Listening is the willingness to be influenced by what's being said. So how can you do that? And then listen with empathy, be humble, be vulnerable. That's incredibly important. And then respond in a balanced and thoughtful way. Again, not to solve problems, but to create a dialogue and to create a conversation. And I don't think anybody needs to read a book in order to figure out how to do that.
Thank you so much for that.
And let me add to that too, Bobby, that, there are really no right or wrong answers to this either. I mean, what you've got to do is step out and try something, because I think doing nothing is really not an option. I think we've got to demonstrate that we're interested and we want to do something. And let me just say that Blacks are not monolithic. We don't all feel the same way about issues. So we're going to have divergent opinions about it. But I think if we have an opinion and you are trying to encourage people to express it, then I think it's got to be an unintimidating environment. So instead of somebody coming to your office, maybe you should come see them. Or maybe you could invite them to a restaurant or to a Starbucks and have a cup of coffee, because that's sort of a non-intimidating way to really begin to talk to individuals. And I also like this whole notion about make it a listening session. I know some senior executives who will come in and have a meeting with you and ask you for your opinion, and they'll end up talking most of the time and most of the conversation. Now, Bobby, don't say that might be me, because it might be.
Please
But,
stop.
I would like to hope not, but I think listening actively is also really important.
Thank you for that, Beverly. And for the record, that is not the case. John, I want to share this with you. I know you have to roll off, but the relationship between inclusive culture and pay equity, and how can employers, what can they do to reconcile the two when you basically have conflicting realities in the workplace? And that's the inclusive culture on one end and pay equity on the other. What do you have any thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenging issue. I think it gets back to if you're gonna have the right kind of culture, you got to look at every decision making process that you have, and try to create try to look at that and see if the net result is something that's caused by by some kind of bias, right? Pay decisions like employment decisions and promotion decisions and who gets sent to training decisions, all of those, lead up to somebody having success in their career. Pay is kind of like the scorecard. And if at the end of it, the scorecard looks out of whack, maybe something in all of those systems that lead up to that end point of creating a great employee, a great leader for the company. So, the thing I've learned in my work is that Fred mentioned biases, and the fact that, I know that there are 180 documented cognitive biases, 180. And, they actually are there because they do serve a purpose. I mean, our brain takes 2% of our body, but it uses 20% of our energy every day. And what it did is it takes a lot of shortcuts, and those shortcuts show up as biases, right? So sometimes they serve us well. But here's what I know. You cannot debias people. So you have to debias the systems and the decision-making systems so that the end result, when you get down the road and you're looking at the scorecard, which is often pay, you wipe out the equity. So in other words, what are some examples of debiasing systems? Using panel interviews, making sure that when you fill a job, you use make sure you have a diverse slate. Make sure that when you're creating training and development opportunities, and when you're giving key people projects, you're making sure that you're looking out for diverse talent. So all of these decisions along the way, you're using processes and tools that don't rely on the bias of individual leaders. Use group processes, use assessment tools so that you debias the system, recognizing it's hard to debias people. And at the end of the day, you get down the road and you see that you have some inequities in the pay. You've got to figure out a way to adjust it.
Thank you so much for that, John. Well, folks, this brings us to the close of our panel discussion today. We truly appreciate the engagement, the great answers based upon the numerous questions that we couldn't even make it to. We're very thankful for those of you who participated. Reminded of that Asian proverb that says, don't curse the darkness, but instead light a candle in the dark. And we're appreciative of the way so many of you all are doing your part in your respective places to light a candle in the dark and to work toward that better day. So we're very thankful to have every one of you on the line, and we look forward to engaging you in the very near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.